Hello, and welcome to the General Commission on Religion and Race's Vital Conversations series. In this series, we are featuring thought leaders, pastors, theologians, activists, authors, and scholars who are sharing their stories, their insights, and their expertise in support of GCOR's mission to build the capacity of the United Methodist Church to be contextually relevant and to reach more people, younger people, and more diverse people. We are delighted that you're joining in on the Vital Conversations movement, dealing with issues related to faith, culture, and fighting oppression in the church and world today. I'm pleased to introduce Reverend Cynthia Moore-Koikoi's Vital Conversation talk on the ways in which the church can build bridges instead of walls to the surrounding community. Reverend Koikoi is District Superintendent for the Baltimore Metropolitan District of the Baltimore, Washington Annual Conference. In her role as District Superintendent, she continuously challenges churches to reach out and build relationships in the surrounding community. Reverend Koikoi knows firsthand of the power of the church to be a source of hope and redemption to communities embroiled in conflict. She called upon the church to stand up and be a witness of the love and justice of God in the midst of the protests and civil unrest that erupted in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray, an African-American man who died in police custody. We invite you to stay connected with GCOR by following us on Facebook and Twitter, and by visiting our website to learn more about our work and to find resources to assist you in having your own vital conversations. And now, it is my very distinct pleasure to present to you Reverend Cynthia Moore-Koikoi.
Hello, I'm Cynthia Moore-Koikoi, Superintendent of the Baltimore Metropolitan District. My first year on the district, I asked churches to invite me to their neighborhood for a prayer walk. Every Tuesday morning from 7:30 to 8:30, clergy and laity gathered in a different part of the district and walked and prayed. The prayers we uttered were reflective of the culture of the particular church that had invited me. Sometimes the prayers were written prayers. Sometimes they were extemporaneous. Sometimes we just walked in silence. But in all of the prayers, no matter what the form, we shared with God our wishes and desires for the community and asked God to help us see the community the way God sees it. On one particular Tuesday, I decided we would do our prayer walk in the community surrounding the building of one of the churches that had closed. This church building was in a neighborhood that had been gentrified. The row homes that surrounded the church building were now renovated and being sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The congregation that once worshiped in that building had not been able to weather the transition of the neighborhood. Looking around the neighborhood, the church building, which for years had housed the United Methodist congregation, was now the only building showing signs of decay. The irony was jarring. As we walked through the neighborhood, asking God to help us see what God sees, we saw a school building in the distance. A number of us said, "Let's go pray outside the school." We started to walk toward the school, but soon ran into an iron fence that prevented us from getting to the school. The fence extended as far as we could see in either direction. So we stood on one side of the fence, the side with renovated homes, with homeowners of many races, looking to the other side, the side with trash in the street and dilapidated home after dilapidated home. We stood there, wanting, yearning to get to the other side, but we could not get past the barrier in front of us. So we stretched out our hands toward the school and prayed. But as we prayed, I was convicted by the fact that as a church, we too often let barriers, whether those barriers are physical, social, economic, spiritual, cultural, or church polity barriers, we let barriers keep us in a place of stretching our hands out to pray, rather than using the work of our hands as instruments of those prayers. I realized in that moment that the same fences that keep the other out also keep us in, and we become isolated one from another. Here's where the truth really hurt. I was convicted by the fact that I had driven by that fence that was keeping us from the school so many times that I had stopped seeing it. At the time of our prayer, I had no idea how important those convictions would be. You see, the fence that prevented us from going to the other side of the street is a fence that runs along the main street that goes into Sandtown, Winchester. Sandtown, the home of Freddie Gray and ground zero of the unrest in Baltimore. It's a fence that provides a barrier between Sandtown, Winchester and the affluent, gentrified Bolton Hills. During our prayer walk, we as a church could not figure out a way to get over that fence. During the unrest, many young people were saying that the figurative fence must come down. And some were saying it must come down by any means necessary. Since that prayer walk and during the unrest in Baltimore, I continued to reflect on this issue of barriers that prevents the church from being in authentic ministry with folks in urban centers. Some of the barriers seem to be pretty innocuous. Barriers like fences, lack of parking, and one-way streets. But some of the barriers are so embedded in our culture that they isolate us without us even realizing that we're in isolation. They are social barriers such as language and dress. You can tell what neighborhoods people in Baltimore come from based on the language they use and their accents. Whether they say zinc or sink, water or water, can open or close doors not only to meaningful employment, but also to leadership positions in the churches. The unrest in Baltimore highlighted the economic fences we have erected. The graduation rate in Baltimore City Public Schools has risen to 73%. That figure does not account for those students who drop out early on in their high school career. In some of our urban communities, the only entrepreneurial role models our young people see are those involved in the drug trade. The other opportunities they have for employment do not offer them a way out of the generational poverty that they see all around them. Because they are trapped by their language, trapped by their education, trapped by their lack of job opportunities, many young people become hopeless. All around them, they see abandoned and decayed buildings. They see streets and sidewalks lined with trash. Day and night, they hear sirens. They're trapped psychologically, unable to get past the fences and overcome the barriers that isolate them. This is the reality of the world in which we are called to do ministry. We are struggling to know how to get over the fences. We are okay with stretching out our hands to pray or writing a check or even coming into the city every now and then to do a mission project. But I think we are being called not to get around the fences, but to tear them down. We even have some institutional fences in our beloved denomination. In Baltimore City, we have some of the oldest cathedral structures in our denomination. It is not easy to do the ministry of removing fences when you have to care for a building that is over 200 years old. And because of those aging buildings and the economic realities of doing ministry in the city, our pastors in the city are sometimes our lowest paid pastors. Yet, their ministries require some of the longest ministry hours and greatest skill sets. What would it look like if, as a denomination, we decided we would find a way to fully fund urban ministry so that the talented pastors that we have working in our urban centers were not making financial sacrifices in order to serve in the city? What would it look like if our denomination made a decision about whether or not it's a good witness to preserve historic worship centers? And if it is determined that these centers should be preserved, what would it look like if the denomination decided to support our urban congregations in the care of those historic buildings, by retrofitting the inside of those buildings for 22nd century ministry. What fences could be brought down if a worshiping congregation of 100 people didn't have to bear the burden of paying a full-time pastor, spending over $60,000 a year just in gas and electricity, and repairing the $500,000 rosary window that the Historical Society says must be restored using glass from Italy? The answers to these questions may seem impossible, but this is what I know to be true. God specializes in tearing down fences and barriers. Jesus specialized in bringing individual people and communities of people out of isolation and into full community. People like the demoniac and the woman at the well. Communities of people like tax collectors and Gentiles. I saw Jesus begin to do the work of tearing down fences during the unrest in Baltimore. The day after the fire at the CVS on the corner of Pennsylvania and North Avenues, hundreds of pastors in Baltimore gathered for a peace march in Sandtown, Winchester. As we marched for peace, there was chaos all around us and riot police approaching us. But I also noticed that young adults were beginning to surround us. These young people did not look or talk like church people, but they began to walk with us and in fact protect us from cars and riot police, even quieting the crowd when we knelt to pray. Riding in their SUVs, they followed us back to the church where we ended our walk. Once back at the church, we didn't really know what to do. By following us on the walk and back to the church, these young people had torn down the fence between them and the church. We, the pastors, had to have the courage to cross over to the other side. And praise God, we did. One pastor extended his hand, and one of the young men embraced him. We all then began to embrace one another, pastors and gang members in community. We went into the church and had dialogue together. As clergy, we had to admit that we had isolated ourselves from these young men and women. We had allowed the systemic fences of culture, economics, righteous piety, and the institutional church to keep us isolated. But that day, because the gang members figured out a way to start tearing down the fence, we found community. And we were able to offer something that we can do better than anyone else. We offered hope. Because of that hope, two of the young men continued to have conversation with one of the United Methodist lay ministers who marched with us. And those two young men, who had been caught up in the drug trafficking trade, enrolled in Coppin State University. Fences. They are designed to keep the other out and us in. But look what can happen when we allow God to use us to tear those fences down.